The first sound in Trauma Bay 3 was not the heart monitor or the squeal of wheels over tile. It was laughter, sharp and careless, cutting through the rush of rain and urgency just as the ambulance doors flew open, and two paramedics pushed in a soaked, broad-shouldered man whose lashes still carried sea salt and whose navy thermal shirt was dark with blood at the collar. Water dripped from the gurney onto the polished floor in thin, cold lines. Someone called for suction. Someone else shouted out a falling pressure. The room moved with the familiar frenzy of practiced emergency medicine, but near the supply cabinet, a resident gave a quick smirk toward the nurse already gloving up as if she had seen this storm coming long before the first drop ever hit the windows. Dr. Graham Voss, immaculate even in chaos, snapped at her to hand over the chart and let the adults handle the trauma. A few people chuckled because people often laughed when Voss cut someone down. He was handsome, polished, adored by donors, and frightening in the particular way polished men could be. He knew how to humiliate without raising his voice and make it appear like instruction. The nurse he dismissed did not flinch. Elena Marquez only stepped closer to the gurney and fixed her attention where it belonged, on the patient's chest rather than the noise surrounding him. His hair was wet, his sternum bruised, and the left side of his chest lagged on each breath with a subtle but ominous delay. His pulse pressure was narrowing. His fingers were too cold. The ID band slapped onto his wrist by triage was smeared by seawater, the ink half gone. Elena took in all of it in one controlled look and said quietly that he was crashing. Voss, still arranging the airway team around himself like a man positioning cameras, dismissed her assessment with the practiced contempt he reserved for people he believed existed beneath him. He said the patient was hypothermic and had aspirated, as if naming two obvious things made him master of all the hidden ones. Then the patient's eyes fluttered open. For one strange fragment of a second, his gaze found Elena, unfocused but searching, as though some buried part of him recognized not her face but her presence, a familiar steadiness in the middle of rising danger. A heartbeat later the monitor screamed. Pressure fell harder. A resident called the numbers out loud. Voss ordered preparation for intubation. Elena was already moving. She adjusted the suction tubing before anyone asked, lifted the patient's shoulder just enough to change the angle of breathing, and felt a cold recognition settle in her stomach. It was not fear. It was the distinct, disciplined alarm of pattern recognition arriving faster than proof. She said there were no breath sounds on the left, and that decompression needed to be ready immediately. Voss answered with a warning laugh and told her he had not asked for commentary. The first-year resident at his side, Dr. Amina Shah, hesitated between rank and reality. She was brilliant, young, and still early enough in her training to believe hierarchy and certainty often traveled together. Her eyes flicked from Elena to the patient and back to Voss. In those tiny spans of hesitation, lives could disappear. The man on the bed convulsed once, not dramatically, just a terrible involuntary shudder as oxygen saturation dipped. Rain battered the windows so hard it sounded like static. Elena lowered her voice and told Amina to bring the tray now. The resident moved before she fully realized she had chosen. That was when Voss finally turned, irritation already sharpening his face, and the room changed. 2 hours earlier, Elena Marquez had been exactly who St. Catherine's Medical Center believed she was, and no more. She was a quiet night shift emergency nurse in a faded scrub jacket. A woman many people barely noticed until they needed a difficult IV started on the first try, a panicked family calmed, or a crashing patient stabilized without fanfare. She worked on the south side of Coronado Bay, where the hospital's glass entrance faced the marina, and the wealthy often arrived angry about wait times, while fishermen arrived apologizing for bleeding on the floor. Administrators called the place a center of excellence. Staff who had spent enough nights under fluorescent fatigue called it a stage. On that stage, Graham Voss performed beautifully. He was the emergency department medical director, silver beginning at his temples, perfect with cameras, immaculate with donors, effortlessly attentive when wealthy families watched. He remembered names in front of boards and forgot them when nurses questioned his decisions. Elena had been there 11 months, enough for everyone to know her schedule and almost no one to know anything real about her. She spoke softly, charted with painful accuracy, joined no gossip, clipped her badge straight every shift, traded holidays without complaint, stayed late when the board tore. Ned read and left homemade coffee cake in the break room after ugly nights without ever attaching a note. In a healthier workplace, those habits might have earned her immediate respect. At St. Catherine's, they mostly rendered her convenient. The first humiliations of a shift were rarely dramatic. A resident might hand her instructions with the slow, exaggerated patience people used on strangers at airport kiosks. A senior nurse might skip over her during huddle until Alina quietly supplied the missing answer no one else had. A transporter once asked if she was still orienting after nearly a year because she did not advertise competence loudly enough to fit his idea of experience. Voss specialized in subtler forms. He never called her incompetent because direct accusations could be challenged. Instead, he called her careful in a tone that transformed precision into timidity. He referred to her as the department's librarian when she corrected a medication timing. He once remarked in front of a resident that some nurses mistook silence for wisdom and routine for expertise. Alina had looked at him, then returned her eyes to the monitor and continued working. That silence irritated him more than open conflict. Men like Voss needed resistance to complete the theater of dominance. Without it, their cruelty echoed back at them too plainly. Around him orbited those who had learned which gravity paid. Brenda Keats, the charge nurse, laughed too quickly at his jokes and repeated his opinions as if they were institutional policy. A few residents copied his tone because insecurity often dressed itself as hierarchy. Even nurses who knew better kept their heads down because hospitals remembered who influenced schedules. Still, there had always been details about Alina that did not fit the story people preferred. When she grew tired, she sometimes slipped into 24-hour time without noticing. She could hear a ventilator alarm from halfway down the corridor and identify the problem before most people got to the room. Once, when a veteran in withdrawal began shouting naval abbreviations no one else recognized, Alina had taken his hands, lowered her voice, and answered in the same clipped cadence until the man broke into tears of relief and called her doctor before finally sleeping. Curiosity stirred around moments like that, but never long. In institutions built on rank, genuine curiosity was expensive because it risked discovering the wrong people had been underestimated. On the evening of the storm at 5:40, Alina stood in the ambulance entrance holding coffee that had long gone cold and watched a Navy helicopter angle over the bay. Most people looked up because helicopters were loud. Alina looked up because her body still tracked approach angle, wind shift, and timing without needing permission from her conscious mind. A paramedic named Lewis, old enough to know the difference between humility and concealment, noticed. He teased her for watching aircraft as if grading them. Alina called it a bad habit. He asked if she had military family. She gave him a small, closed smile and said only that her family was full of bad habits. Lewis let it go because experienced medics understood that some answers were complete precisely because they ended the conversation. Later, in the locker room, Brenda saw Alina remove a heavy bronze coin from her pocket and place it face down inside the locker beneath folded clothes. When asked if it was a lucky charm, Alina had only said it was something like that. Brenda laughed and suggested she might need it because Voss was in one of his moods. Alina touched the locker door once after Brenda walked away, not superstitiously, but with the precise gesture of someone checking that a memory remained where she had left it. There were more small clues if anyone had been paying attention. During a ruptured appendix case, a resident asked for a central line kit, and the tech fumbled the sterile packaging. Alina reached over and opened the field in one exact, fluid sequence so fast, and practiced that the resident stopped mid-complaint to ask where she had learned to set a tray like that. She answered only that it had been a long time ago. When he guessed branches of service, she met his eyes just long enough to make him regret the question and repeated that it had been a long time ago. Later still, when the rain began and the hospital lights flickered once, most of the department cursed the weather and carried on. Alina moved quietly through the unit checking flashlights, oxygen backups, battery levels, exits, and supply carts without being told. A security guard watched her pass and muttered to himself that whoever trained her had not done things halfway. He was right in a way he could not yet understand. At 8:12, Harbor Dispatch alerted local emergency departments to a multi-casualty incident near the marina. A private launch had lost power in heavy rain and slammed broadside into a maintenance barge. Near the channel markers, it was not a cinematic disaster, just steel, current, panic, cold water, and the kind of confusion that killed without spectacle. Several civilians had gone overboard. One man had reportedly entered the water again and again to pull others out before collapsing on the dock. Brenda asked who he was. Lewis, speaking over the tinny radio, said the identity was unconfirmed, but local officials were already making calls, which usually meant someone important. Voss straightened his coat and made a joke about looking competent, and like most of his jokes, it was funny only because it was half true. The first ambulances brought shivering victims, a woman with a broken wrist, a dockhand with a scalp laceration, an older man with hypothermia and a bad rhythm. The emergency department blurred into that exact species of chaos where every sound carried potential consequence. Alina moved through it without ever seeming hurried, laying warm blankets, correcting labels, reassuring families, starting lines, recognizing instability before it announced itself. She handled triage less as a sequence of tasks than as an arrangement of weight, instinctively knowing where the room leaned and where it might collapse. Then the last gurney arrived, flanked by Harbor Patrol and two plainclothes federal officers trying not to look like federal officers. The patient was conscious only in fragments. His skin had gone gray under seawater. His lips were blue at the edges. He breathed with that deep inward pull of a body trying and failing to satisfy itself. One side of his chest already darkened with bruising. His knuckles were split, likely from pulling himself against metal. There was nothing theatrical about him, but authority clung to him anyway, even half drowned and losing. A harbor officer identified him as Commander Lucas Dane. The room recalibrated instantly. Dane was known throughout the city, though never because he sought attention. He was a decorated naval officer, public face of a veterans recovery fund, a man the local news called on national holidays because he spoke about service without polishing himself into a hero. Donors knew his name. Politicians knew it too. Graham Voss's face sharpened with opportunity. Alina, hearing the name, went still for one brief heartbeat. That stillness was so brief no one noticed it. But names arrived with history attached, and Lucas Dane was not just a public figure to Alina. She knew the shape of the name from somewhere much older and much less polished than the city's memory of him. When she stepped in to cut away the soaked shirt at his shoulder, she saw beneath the bruising an old scar near the clavicle and recognized it before she allowed herself to know she recognized it. It was a healed mark from a field procedure performed years earlier under terrible conditions by hands that had not been permitted to shake. Her own hands did not shake now. Dane's eyes opened again, cloudy with pain and hypoxia, and traveled over Voss, over the ceiling lights, over the blur of the room before finding Alina once more. His brow tightened as if something in him was trying to push through pain toward memory. Voss declared the airway compromised and announced intubation. Alina leaned closer, listening not merely to his breath but to the structure of it, tasting seawater and blood in the air, seeing shallow expansion on the left and a body that was not only drowning but being compressed from within. She said this was not just aspiration and that pressure was building. Voss ignored her the way men in power often ignored warnings that came from the wrong mouth. Amina, more careful than him, observed asymmetry, but Voss cut her off and dismissed what he called ordinary trauma. He was already narrating the case for the room, performing mastery at exactly the moment when humility would have saved time. Alina adjusted the pulse oximeter and watched the number sink. She leaned near the patient's ear and told him to stay with the room. His gaze flickered toward her. Maybe he heard the words. Maybe he heard only the tone. Either way, his hand moved an inch toward hers before sedation took him under. The intubation itself went smoothly. Voss was genuinely skilled, and skill was part of what made him dangerous. He was not a fraud. He was simply a man too accustomed to being obeyed to notice when reality had stopped listening. The tube was secured, ventilator settings adjusted, orders called, portable X-ray requested. For a few seconds the room tried to convince itself it had stabilized. Then Dane's heart rate climbed while his pressure dropped harder. A resident suggested pressors. Alina said no immediately. Voss swung toward her, offended less by the content than by the interruption. Alina pointed to the patient's neck and chest, indicated the distended neck veins and the left side that still barely moved. She silenced one non-essential alarm, and suddenly the asymmetry became impossible to. Miss, Amina said the diagnosis aloud at last. Tension pneumothorax. Voss ordered needle decompression as if that settled the matter, but everyone in the bay knew seconds had been burned first in denial. Saturation dipped again. The line on the monitor thinned and fluttered. Alina was already opening the kit and passing it toward Amina because Voss, distracted by competing demands in the next bay, hesitated near the ultrasound cart. That pause, tiny and human, could have become fatal. Alina told Amina where to go and to move. The resident obeyed. The rush of trapped air escaped in a violent hiss, and Dane's chest rose more fully on the next assisted breath. One crisis answered, not all of them. Alina's eyes stayed on the pressure, still too low, on the color that did not return, on the bruised shadow spreading near the sternum, on the way improvement kept dying halfway to recovery. She saw the remaining danger like a shape under dark water and told the room to scan his heart. Voss snapped that he did not take orders from nurses. Alina turned to him with the first open steel anyone there had ever seen in her and told him to take the order from the patient. Silence hit the room. Amina pushed the ultrasound probe into Voss's hand because truth had started moving faster than ego. He scanned once, adjusted, scanned again, and fluid appeared around the heart. Pericardial effusion, tamponade building. For the first time all night, he looked unprepared. Alina told them to page thoracic surgery immediately. Brenda stared at the screen, horrified by what she now saw and by what it meant she had failed to see. Alina repeated the instruction, and this time Brenda ran. The next 4 minutes blurred into the ugly grace of emergency salvage. Pressure on lines, medication, surgeon called, tray opened, waveform watched with almost religious focus. Lucas Dane lost pulse briefly, not long enough for legend, long enough for death to step into the doorway. Alina counted rhythm under her breath and listened to the spaces between panic. When the thoracic surgeon arrived, buttoning his gown wrong because he had dressed while running, he glanced at the ultrasound and immediately asked who had caught it. No one answered at first because the answer stood directly in front of them, still working. The surgeon did not waste time on politics. He performed the emergency procedure with swift brutality, dark blood drained, and the pressure rose. The monitor settled into something that could keep a body alive. Dane did not wake, but he stopped dying. The silence afterward was different from the silence Alina usually carried. This silence belonged to witnesses. The thoracic surgeon stripped off bloody gloves and asked again who had called tamponade before the scan. Amina answered before caution could stop her and named Nurse Marquez. The surgeon gave Alina the brief, professional nod one competent clinician gives another. It should have been a turning point. It should have earned respect. Instead, it made Graham Voss angry. A witness could forgive being wrong. An egotist could not forgive being seen wrong. He snapped everyone back to work and insisted that no one was making saints out of protocol. Then he turned on Alina and in a voice low enough to stay deniable and cruel enough to wound, accused her of directing a resident over an attending physician in his trauma bay. Alina answered with simple facts. The patient had been unstable. He had been dying. Voss insisted the patient had been his. Alina responded that she remembered her role exactly. That should have ended it. It did not. 15 minutes later, Voss called her into the staff conference room. Brenda stood beside him with a tablet. Human resources was absent, which meant whatever was about to happen was not formal enough to protect Alina and not informal enough to ignore. Voss announced that her conduct had been insubordinate. Brenda, borrowing authority she did not possess, said he was documenting a chain of command deviation. In a hospital, that sort of language could poison a career if attached to the wrong outcome by the wrong name. Alina understood at once. Amina passed in the hall, slowed, then kept walking because residents learned early which fights could burn fellowships. Voss accused Alina of issuing directives during a critical intervention and escalating specialty response without attending authorization. Alina said the specialty response had arrived because it was needed. He smiled thinly and told her that was not her decision to make. She answered that it became her responsibility when no one else was making it. Even Brenda looked down because the truth of that sentence was too sharp to survive eye contact. Voss said she would hand over her badge for the remainder of the shift and await administrative review. It was a suspension in all but name, delivered in the middle of a storm after she had helped save one of the most important patients to enter the hospital that year. Alina unclipped her badge and set it on the table without drama. That calm frightened Brenda more than anger would have. Word spread through the department the way bad news always did, by altered eye contact and whispers around corners rather than by announcement. People heard that Marquez had been pulled and then learned, with increasing disbelief, that it had happened after the save. Alina sat alone in the lounge while rain thickened outside. Her scrub cuffs were still damp with harbor water. The room smelled of burnt coffee, disinfectant, and abandoned microwave soup. The muted television overhead showed local marina footage with flashing lights and wet dock boards. The world outside still believed hospitals were made entirely of adults. A respiratory therapist named Nolan came halfway into the room and asked if she was all right. Alina asked whether he meant as a coworker or a witness. He said both. She told him she was fine, and he accepted the lie because it was all she offered. Beside her, half visible from the pocket of her folded jacket, a waterproof olive notebook peeked out for a second before she tucked it back. It had worn corners and no label. Another fragment of a life the hospital had never bothered to imagine. 43 minutes later, the ICU desk called. The call was technically for the emergency department supervisor, but the supervisor was tied up. Brenda was managing staffing, and Alina happened to be closest to the phone. She answered automatically. The ICU nurse on the other end said that Commander Dane's transfer had been completed and 2 federal officers were asking for the nurse who had identified the tamponade. Alina went still. She asked who was asking. The ICU nurse said they had not given rank, only that they wanted names. Before Alina could answer, Brenda entered, heard enough, and took the receiver from her hand with a look that blended fear and calculation. In an overly bright voice, Brenda told ICU that Dr. Voss had managed the case personally. Alina said nothing, but in that one sentence she learned more about Brenda than any apology could later repair. Brenda listened while the person on the other end kept talking, and the color drained from her face. When she hung up, Alina asked what they had said. Brenda avoided her eyes and answered that hospital administration was on the way down because someone very senior from Naval Special Warfare was coming to the hospital that night. Quiet consequence moved through the building before the man himself arrived. Captain Owen Rourke came in without spectacle at 10:37 p.m. He wore a dark raincoat, carried no umbrella, and did not need an introduction from anyone who had ever spent time around command. He was tall, late 50s, hard-eyed, rain still shining on his shoulders. He was followed by the hospital attorney, a security director, and an administrator whose slower heels gave away more than her face did. He did not ask for coffee or waste time on pleasantries. He simply said he wanted the full timeline from intake to transfer. Graham Voss stepped forward first, polished and eager, introducing himself as medical director and announcing that Commander Dane was stable thanks to rapid intervention by their team. Rourke looked at him once the way a man might assess the soundness of a bridge before deciding whether to step onto it, then repeated that he wanted the timeline. The department quieted around the edges of that sentence. Administration hustled involved staff toward the consult room. Alina remained in the lounge until Brenda appeared at the door and said that all directly involved personnel were wanted present. Then, trying one final time to preserve the old order, Brenda advised Alina not to say much. Alina picked up her jacket and replied that such advice would have mattered more an hour earlier. The consult room filled with the stale heat of wet coats and fluorescent nerves. Rourke stood at one end of the table while the attorney opened a notebook and Voss arranged his face into professional concern. When asked to walk through the case, Voss did it smoothly, almost convincingly. Harbor trauma intake, near-drowning complications, rapid airway intervention, recognition of thoracic compromise, surgical escalation, transfer to ICU. It was all technically true and therefore a more dangerous kind of lie. He used the word team whenever credit sounded noble and singular pronouns whenever leadership sounded useful. Rourke let him finish. Then he asked who had called thoracic surgery at 2031. No one answered. The attorney suggested reviewing the chart, but Rourke said he was not asking the chart. Amina Shah, pale and very young-looking under the lights, said that Nurse Marquez had initiated the page request after the attending identified the issue. Voss tried to reclaim control by adding that it had been under his direction. Rourke turned to Amina and asked again. This time she breathed in and told the truth cleanly. Nurse. Marquez had been first to identify the pattern. She had urged decompression and cardiac scan before the attending confirmed it. The room tightened. Brenda looked at the table as if the laminate might split and swallow her. Rourke's attention moved at last to Alina, not like a man discovering her, but like a man deciding how much of her history the others had earned. He asked for her assessment. Alina gave it in clinical sequence. Mechanism, asymmetric expansion, absent breath sounds, pressure trend, persistent hypotension after decompression, concern for tamponade. No embellishment, no self-defense, just medicine. When she finished, Rourke asked why she had been removed from duty. The hospital attorney looked up sharply because that detail had clearly not been included in the sanitizing summaries. Voss said it had been a temporary administrative hold related to communication boundaries during active trauma. Rourke let the absurdity of the phrase hang in the air until it exposed itself. Then he requested the incident report, all chart logs, badge access records, overhead timestamps, security footage, and the initial radio intake summary. He understood institutions well enough to know they lied best through omission and phrasing. While administrators scattered to gather records, the room remained trapped together. Voss made the mistake of pressing Alina again in front of witnesses, saying that whatever her observations, her manner had been disruptive. Alina told him that what he meant was urgent. He replied that it had been outside her scope. She answered that recognizing a dying patient was inside every competent clinician's scope. From the hallway came a faint rustle of staff pretending to work nearby while waiting to see what Truth would do when finally invited indoors. Voss forced a brittle smile and accused her of making teamwork difficult. Alina told him that memory, not attitude, was what made revision difficult. Power shifted without anyone touching. The room changed again. At 11:18, an ICU nurse appeared in the doorway and asked which of them was Marquez. Rourke answered immediately. The nurse, surprised by the certainty, explained that Commander Dane was intermittently awake and had asked for someone called Echo. He had tried again and insisted that she was here. Every sound in the room seemed to retreat. Voss objected at once, claiming the patient might be disoriented and that such a request was not medically appropriate. The nurse said the request had been specific. Rourke asked Voss with deadly flatness who he was to believe his objection outweighed the patient's request. No one rescued Voss. Alina stood there calm and exhausted, not triumphant. Rourke told her to come with him and called her chief. The word landed in the room with the force of metal dropped on tile. Brenda physically stepped back. Amina stared. Voss stopped looking like the most important man in the hospital. Alina answered quietly that she was not a chief anymore. Rourke said some histories did not work that way. The ICU corridor was dimmer, all softened machines and controlled midnight. Rourke walked beside Alina rather than ahead of her. Outside Dane's room they paused. Through the glass he looked less like a known public figure and more like a man unwillingly returned from deep water, bandaged high on the chest, oxygen in place, face lined by pain and survival. Rourke said she should have told him she was in that hospital. Alina replied that she had not known Lucas would be the one brought in. He said she had recognized him. She admitted she had recognized the scar. Rourke did not push further. He understood that she had left the service seeking distance, not erasure, and that there was a difference. Inside the room, Dane's eyes were only half open, but the moment he found Alina, his face changed into certainty. His lips failed once, then formed the old call sign on the second attempt. Echo. She took his hand when he lifted 2 fingers weakly from the blanket. She told him surgery had gone well and he was in ICU. He rasped that he had known her voice. She told him not to make her feel old. He almost smiled. Rourke stepped into view and told him he should be resting. Dane ignored that and said he had told them Alina would see it. She exhaled through her nose and answered that she had nearly not gotten the chance. His eyes shifted to the empty place on her scrub top where her badge should have been, and even through medication, he understood enough to ask who had pulled her. She tried to put it aside, but he said it could not wait. The ICU nurse hovered, alarmed at how much he was talking, while he whispered that she was still the best in the room and then asked Rourke to make it right before drifting back under sedation. Outside the room, the corridor seemed smaller. Word had begun leaking already. An aide stared openly. 2 ICU nurses whispered in disbelief. A resident stood frozen by the vending machine, clearly having foe. Forgotten why she had come. One whispered name had undone an entire false hierarchy. Back in the consult room, Rourke placed a thin waterproof folder on the table and said that speculation was active enough that he might as well reduce it. Then he explained only what everyone present needed to know and no more. Before working at St. Catherine's, Alina Marquez had served 18 years in Navy medicine, including advanced operational assignment with Naval Special Warfare Support elements. During field operations, her internal call sign had been Echo because when communications failed and conditions collapsed, she remained clear enough for everyone else to hear themselves think. There was no boast in the wording, which made it more devastating. Rourke continued with factual details stripped of spectacle. Combat medic training, mass casualty stabilization, austere trauma management, commendations not public honorable departure by request after family circumstances and cumulative injury. He gave her enough history to stop the room from trivializing her and withheld enough to protect what was still hers. Voss, clinging to process because process was the last shelter left to him, said that if such a background had been relevant, it should have been disclosed to hospital leadership. Alina answered before Rourke could that her nursing license, certifications, and employment records had all been fully disclosed, and that her past was not a credentialing deficiency but her life. The point landed. Then Rourke supplied the last context necessary for the room to understand the recognition between her and Lucas Dane. Years earlier, during a maritime extraction gone wrong in brutal weather, Dane had sustained a chest injury far from surgical support. The clinician who had kept him alive long enough to reach a shipboard operating room had been then Chief Alina Marquez. Same chest, same patient, same woman the department had spent 11 months underestimating because she did not market herself. The old scar she had recognized was one she had helped create in the service of survival. The speed with which she identified his deterioration now was not luck but memory disciplined by harsher consequences than embarrassment. Brenda made a small involuntary sound and covered it badly. Amina looked at Alina with a stunned, respectful disbelief that felt almost painful in its sincerity. Voss offered one last defense about past experience not excusing insubordination in a civilian setting. Rourke turned another page and said that was fortunate because the discussion was not about insubordination, but about whether his team had punished the clinician who identified a life-threatening condition he initially missed. After that, the night ceased belonging to personalities and began belonging to records. Security footage showed Alina reaching for the decompression tray before most of the room registered the need. Trauma bay audio, imperfect but adequate, captured her saying there were no breath sounds on the left long before Voss acknowledged it. Chart logs showed thoracic escalation initiated within seconds of her request. Badge access records confirmed she had been removed from duty before any formal supervisory process. Amina gave a written statement. Nolan from respiratory did the same. Lewis, the paramedic, confirmed that Alina had warned of instability immediately on arrival. Even the thoracic surgeon, annoyed at being dragged into hospital politics, stated dryly that the patient would likely have deteriorated past salvage if surgical backup had been delayed any longer. These were no longer interpretations. They were a pattern. Administration, which had hoped to manage optics, now faced a far uglier problem: a prominent patient, federal witnesses, internal retaliation, incomplete reporting, and a medical director whose certainty was beginning to look expensive. Brenda, interviewed separately, lasted barely any time before contradicting her own earlier claim that Voss had personally ordered everything. Fear made bad liars out of otherwise competent adults. By 12:26, the chief nursing officer arrived in person, hair loose under fatigue, coat thrown over scrubs, wearing the expression of a woman who had already read enough to know apology would be the minimum cost of the night. The public correction happened not behind closed doors, but in the glass-walled conference area near the emergency department, where staff leaving break could see without needing to pretend. That mattered because humiliation had been made public and fairness, to mean anything, needed witnesses too. The chief nursing officer stood with hospital counsel, the chief medical officer on phone, Rourke and Voss. Alina stood opposite them until Amina and two senior nurses quietly moved to her side. The chief nursing officer said that after review of available documentation, Nurse Marquez's removal from duty had been improper. Her clinical judgment had been sound. Her actions had materially contributed to life-saving intervention. It was not enough, but it was the beginning. She continued by saying Alina's badge and duties were reinstated immediately, the administrative notation would be voided, and a formal review of physician conduct and supervisory response was already underway. Voss objected that it was premature. Hospital counsel cut across him and said what had been premature was his disciplinary action. Murmurs moved through the watching staff. The chief nursing officer said Alina was owed an apology. Alina did not ease the moment for anyone. She asked from whom. The answer required no speaking. Everyone looked at Graham Voss. He searched for a version of remorse that might preserve his dignity, began with a conditional phrase, and was stopped by counsel before the lie of that could form fully. Then he swallowed and admitted plainly that he had been wrong. Alina's assessment had been correct, and his response afterward had been inappropriate. Alina did not let him escape by accepting something too vague. She said he had publicly questioned her professionalism, removed her from patient care after she helped save a life, and allowed others to believe credit belonged elsewhere. His face flushed, and outside the glass someone shifted hard enough to bump a chair. He admitted that too. Alina thanked him with devastating restraint. The chief nursing officer then announced that Voss was being relieved of clinical leadership pending full investigation into retaliation, reporting failures, and conduct concerns. Brenda Keats was removed from charge authority until review completion. An independent audit of emergency department culture would begin at once. No one cheered. Real institutional justice rarely sounded like triumph. It sounded like titles changing, pens moving, and the quiet panic of people rewriting emails before dawn. The aftermath felt stranger than the injustice itself, because institutions were clumsy when pivoting from dismissal to praise. By 1 in the morning, people who had overlooked Alina for months suddenly remembered every time she had caught an error, anticipated a crash, or salvaged a line. A pediatric nurse came down to say she had always known Alina was special, which was kind but historically false. A resident apologized awkwardly for laughing at Voss's jokes weeks earlier. A technician brought Alina fresh coffee without being asked and looked so embarrassed by the gesture that she nearly apologized for the cup. Alina accepted almost none of it except the coffee. Amina stayed closest, not out of fascination but conviction. She admitted she should have backed Alina sooner. Alina told her she had moved when it counted. Amina said she had still hesitated. Alina told her to learn what hesitation cost and never repeat it. In the ICU, Lucas Dane slept under close watch, unaware of how far one whispered call sign had already traveled through the building. Captain Rourke found Alina briefly alone near the medication room and told her she had handled the matter cleanly. She said she was too tired to be complimented. He answered that there was the chief he remembered. She leaned against the wall and told him she was not going back to being introduced by her past. He said then she should not, but neither should she let small people redefine it. At 1:47, Alina walked back onto the emergency department floor with her reinstated badge clipped straight at her collar. No one announced her return. The room acknowledged it on its own. Conversations dipped, then steadied. A man with a hand laceration looked at her and said she seemed like the nurse who actually knew what was going on. The simplicity of the sentence almost made her laugh. She told him she did. Then she sutured the next case, restarted a difficult IV in another, and de-escalated an intoxicated patient in hall bed 7 with the same even tone she had used on Lucas Dane. The revelation had changed nothing essential in her work. It had only forced other people to notice what had always been there. Near 3 in the morning, the storm weakened. The windows stopped rattling. Across the marina, the lights sharpened. Brenda approached Alina in the supply alcove, looking stripped down by consequence, her charge authority gone and the years suddenly visible in her face. She said she should have told the truth the first time. Alina answered that yes, she should have. Brenda admitted she had been afraid of what would happen if she crossed Voss. Alina placed IV tubing into the bin and said that something had happened anyway. Brenda's eyes filled. Alina did not comfort her. Not every wound deserved immediate bandaging. By dawn, the hospital had already begun formal repair. Staff received an email confirming temporary leadership adjustments and announcing an external review of emergency department operations, culture, and retaliation safeguards. It omitted names where legal caution required it, but no one struggled to read between. In the lines, anonymous reporting channels were reopened. Nursing escalation procedures were revised to clarify authority during emergent deterioration. Resident training on interdisciplinary response was scheduled. Most telling of all, the chief medical officer added a sentence to the morning safety brief stating that clinical insight was not rank-limited and dismissal of concern was not leadership. In a healthier institution, the sentence would have been too obvious to print. At St. Catherine's, it landed like structural repair. Amina read it twice. Nolan photographed it and sent it to Lewis with a message that said he had been right about her. Lucas woke more fully after sunrise. When Alina visited him this time, he was lucid enough to hold conversation, though pain and medication still dragged at him. She told him he had always had dramatic timing. He answered that she was the one who had managed to save him twice in one lifetime. She told him she would prefer not to make it 3. He studied her face and asked why she had never told them who she was. She said she had come to the hospital to do the work, not explain it. He replied that they had not deserved the explanation. She said that perhaps some of them might still deserve the example. That answer warmed his gaze in a way exhaustion could not fully suppress. He told her she was still herself. She adjusted his blanket, checked his line, and did not let the moment turn sentimental. Their history was too old and too disciplined for that. What passed between them was not romance or spectacle, but the deeper intimacy of people who had once stood between each other and catastrophe, and now found themselves doing so again in fluorescent civilian light. The days that followed did not turn Alina into a celebrity inside the hospital, which she would have loathed. They did something more useful. They made people pause before dismissing her. Residents listened to the ends of her sentences. Certain jokes died before being spoken. The external review widened, and more staff came forward not only about Commander Dane's case, but about months of condescension, retaliation fears, near misses, and the exhausting theater of protecting one physician's ego at the expense of team judgment. Graham Voss had not invented the culture, but he had nourished it. By the second week, his name no longer appeared on the schedule. By the third, Brenda had requested transfer to a lower responsibility role pending final findings. By the fourth, St. Catherine's announced a new interdisciplinary emergency review board, and the chief nursing officer personally asked Alina whether she would serve on it. Alina considered carefully and agreed on one condition: no speeches. The officer, who had learned quickly, accepted. The board met in a room overlooking the bay. Alina arrived early, arranged case summaries, marked the agenda, and when others entered, no one mistook her for support staff. 1 month after the storm, Commander Lucas Dane returned for follow-up imaging. No press office was told. No donors were invited. No hospital photographer appeared. He came in a plain jacket, moving more carefully than before, but with the solid bearing of a man back inside his own body. Captain Rourke accompanied him along with 2 younger members of his team. When he asked the receptionist whether Nurse Marquez was on shift, the receptionist practically straightened in her chair. Alina was in the emergency department reviewing a chest pain admission when the message reached her. She finished the chart note before walking over because, important or not, no patient became a performance piece in her hands. She found Lucas in the quiet corridor near radiology. He looked better, color restored, bruises fading into memory. He observed that she still looked underpromoted. She replied that he looked annoyingly recovered. One of the younger operators nearly grinned. Then Lucas took a small cloth-wrapped object from his pocket and placed it in her palm. It was a challenge coin she had not seen in years, newly minted but bearing the same insignia on one side. On the other was a single engraved word, Echo. She looked up and said it was unnecessary. He said it was overdue. They stood there in the corridor while staff passed around them with the instinctive caution people showed when they sensed significance without being invited into it. One of the younger operators, unable to contain himself, said with deep respect that Lucas spoke about her like a myth. Alina gave Lucas a flat look and said that sounded irresponsible. Rourke answered that they were working on him. Lucas did not look away from Alina when he said that some reputations built themselves because some people kept others alive when panic should have killed them. Alina turned the coin once in her hand and answered, as she always did, that she had never done it alone. Lucas told her that had always been the point. A passing nurse recognized the men, recognized Alina, and almost walked into a supply cart. News of the encounter moved through the building by lunchtime, but differently this time. It did not feel like gossip. It felt like confirmation. Later that day, Amina asked Alina what he had given her. Alina said it was a reminder. Amina asked of what. Alina answered that quiet was not the same as small. Amina held that line as if it were something worth studying. Months passed. The hospital changed not in grand declarations, but in the measurements only insiders knew how to take. Escalations happened faster because nurses were less afraid of punishment for being right. Residents asked more questions and used rank less as a substitute for thought. Briefings began including all disciplines as a matter of function rather than symbolism. The Emergency Review Board rewrote language in policies that had quietly shielded the wrong people for years. Alina became one of the most respected voices in the department without ever becoming its loudest. People sought her out now, but not only because of the story. The story had forced them to revisit evidence they had ignored daily. She had always been the nurse who sensed deterioration before machines caught up, the one who told frightened families the truth without performance, the clinician who cleaned her own bay after a brutal case because someone had to. The revelation had added no virtue. It had only subtracted prejudice. When she oriented new hires, she taught the way she lived, concise and exact. She told interns to listen longer than their ego wanted to because patients usually started talking before they could speak. Amina wrote that down the first time and never forgot it. Nolan sometimes joked that Alina had become legendary by accident. She said legends usually charted badly, and that dry remark was as close to public affection as she ever came. Winter turned to spring. On the anniversary of the harbor storm, the hospital hosted a modest private recognition breakfast for emergency staff, partly because the board had learned how expensive toxic culture could become, and partly because institutions liked commemorating reform after nearly refusing it. Alina tried to skip the event. The chief nursing officer insisted. So she stood at the back of a conference room with coffee in hand, while administrators discovered the language of humility in carefully approved sentences. Several people spoke. The thoracic surgeon mentioned teamwork with his usual irritation at sentiment. Amina spoke briefly about learning not to confuse hierarchy with wisdom. Nolan kept his remarks short because he understood sincerity curdled if overdecorated. Then Lucas Dane, invited quietly and arriving without ceremony, stood and addressed the room. He did not make it about heroism. He did not rehearse his own suffering. He spoke instead about what happened to institutions when they punished truth because it came from the wrong direction. He said that almost losing a patient to injury was one kind of risk, and almost losing one to ego was another. He thanked the emergency department staff who acted, named the value of interdisciplinary courage, and stopped just short of saying what everyone already knew, that a hospital was only as safe as the extent to which its quietest, competent person could be heard. When the breakfast ended, people filtered back to shift change carrying paper cups and altered assumptions. Alina stayed behind briefly to stack chairs because old habits outlasted recognition. The chief nursing officer came over and told her she did not need to do that. Alina said perhaps not, but the chairs still needed stacking. The officer laughed softly and let her continue. That, more than any formal praise, reflected the new culture taking root. Alina was no longer being mistaken for lesser simply because she worked without fanfare. She was being understood, sometimes even followed, precisely because she had never needed fanfare at all. Over time, the sharper edge of the story softened into institutional memory. New staff heard some version of the Storm case during orientation. The details varied, but one lesson remained constant. Competence could not be measured by volume, title, or polish alone. The emergency department became a little quicker to listen, a little slower to condescend, a little less willing to let a polished man define intelligence for everyone else. Alina never volunteered the story. She kept the coin in her locker, not displayed, just placed where her hand could find it on difficult nights. She still worked nights more often than not. She still charted meticulously, still corrected labels without fuss, still brought coffee cake after the worst shifts and left it in the break room without note. She still spoke softly enough that people had to choose to listen. The difference was that now, more often than not, they did. And when they did, rooms held together better. Patients were seen sooner for what they were becoming, resident. Learned the shape of humility earlier. Nurses stood straighter when escalating concerns. Nobody said the hospital had been transformed overnight because institutions that had tolerated harm did not deserve romantic language for incremental repair. But it had changed. A room once arranged around one man's certainty now made more space for observation, memory, and calm. In quieter moments, usually near dawn when the board finally thinned and the marina lights blurred against the earliest blue, Alina would stand for a second near the same ambulance entrance where she had once tracked helicopters in the gathering storm. She would listen to the hiss of the automatic doors, the rustle of distant monitors, the layered breathing of a building that healed and failed and tried again. Sometimes Lewis would find her there and offer coffee. Sometimes Amina would ask one careful question about trauma patterns or command under pressure. Sometimes no one came at all, and that was fine. Alina had never needed an audience. She had needed only a room willing to understand that quietness did not mean emptiness, that restraint was not the opposite of authority, and that the calmest person present might also be the one holding the longest memory of survival. The harbor storm became one story among many in the city's retelling of itself, but inside St. Catharines it remained a benchmark, not because a commander had nearly died or because a medical director had fallen. It mattered because it revealed how close they had come to losing truth under the weight of habit. It reminded people that prejudice in professional spaces often wore the face of assumptions, so ordinary nobody bothered to name them until harm forced language upon them. Alina's example did not become powerful because she had once served in impossible places or because a respected military officer recognized her. It became powerful because she had continued to work with excellence even when no one knew what stood behind it, and because when finally exposed, that hidden history only confirmed what should already have been visible to anyone paying real attention. Lucas Dane recovered fully enough to return to public work, though he carried the scar tissue of the storm and the older scars beneath it with the same unsentimental discipline he always had. He and Alina did not become dramatic symbols to one another. Their connection remained what it had always been, deep, spare, built on crisis, survived rather than words exchanged. Captain Rourke visited the hospital only once more that year, officially for an unrelated administrative conversation and unofficially to ensure certain reforms had not been polished into inaction. Before leaving, he stopped by the emergency department, found Alina charting, and asked if the place was learning. She told him slowly. He said slowly was still movement. She agreed. Then he left without needing to say anything about pride or history, because both of them had outlived the need for easy language. The true ending was not the apology or the suspension of a powerful man or even the restoration of Alina's name. The true ending was that the next time a nurse in that department said a patient was crashing in a way the room had not yet caught up to, people moved faster. They asked better questions. They checked their certainty against the body in front of them. That was the legacy worth having. Not myth, not spectacle, not the romance of a hidden past finally revealed, but a practical change in how human beings treated one another when someone's life narrowed to seconds. Elena Marquez had never wanted to be the center of a story. She had wanted the room to function. In the end, that was exactly what she forced it to do. And so the memory of that night remained not as a tale about a quiet nurse who turned out to be extraordinary, but as a correction to the far more common mistake of assuming that extraordinary people always announce themselves in voices loud enough to satisfy insecure rooms. Sometimes they wore faded scrub jackets. Sometimes they charted in silence. Sometimes they were overlooked until the exact moment overlooking them became dangerous. Sometimes they had once been called Echo because when everything else failed, they were the thing that remained clear. At St. Catherine, after the storm, people learned to hear that kind of clarity sooner. The hospital did not become perfect. No institution did. But it became harder to laugh at the wrong person in a trauma bay and easier to recognize that the steadiest hands in the room did not owe anyone a performance before being believed. That was enough to begin with, and for Elena, who had never asked for more than the chance to do the work cleanly, it was perhaps the most fitting form of justice. She kept showing up. She kept seeing what others missed. She kept speaking only when there was something worth saying. And now, when she did, the room listened.